Perfect. All right, Tony, take it away.
Hey, well, welcome back, folks, to another episode of the American Civil War. We are starting, we've been talking about 1861, and today we're actually going to fight a battle. I bet if you've been with me, you've been wondering, are we ever really going to have a battle of the Civil War? Well, we will today. So let's kind of review what we did last week. We began looking at how the Civil War was really the first war, kind of a lot of people call it the first modern war, fought during the industrial age. And we saw all these new technological innovations, for instance, communications and transportation. You saw the telegraph used on a wide scale, used for the first time in war, the railroad, photography. We looked at innovations in medicine, which the anesthesia inhalers, surgical amputations, nursing. Nursing kind of, developed in the Civil War. Finally, we looked at the advancements in weapons. That's always the case with a war. It seemed like you're always seeing new advancements in weaponry. And sure enough, we saw several, primarily the widespread use of the rifled musket as opposed to the old traditional smoothbore musket, which greatly enhanced the range of these weapons. And we looked then at the mobilization of the Northern armies under the leadership of legendary General Winfield Scott, looked at the mobilization efforts of the Southern armies, how they got their armies going. And then we kind of looked at the difference in the plans. They both had strategic plans for the war. It didn't turn out quite the way they thought. Somewhat to the Northern Army, it did. Uh, Scott had devised what he was called the Anaconda Plan, where he was going to basically split the West from the East. He was going to put kind of squeeze the ports and cut off their supplies and their exports and imports. And to a degree, that's kind of how it ended up working in the long run. Not totally, but at least it kind of had some semblance of what Scott originally planned. The South, on the other hand, had what we call the Cordon Plan, where they were basically going to entrench around their territory, and then as the Union weakened in spots, they would make strategic strikes into the Union to kind of hopefully encourage the people to give up. And then finally, we looked at the uniforms and how that kind of played a part in sometimes in the battles. We always associate the Union with blue, the Southerners with gray, and while that was true a lot, it was all not always true, as we saw. So that's kind of what we did last week. So today we're going to look at the first real battle of the Civil War. Now, there had been other battles, small battles, but they had been kind of insignificant and not on a large scale. Kind of, I guess you'd almost call them skirmishes more than battles. The first Battle of Bull Run, or also known as Manassas, was fought on July 21st, 1861. Now, I've got a map up here. This is Washington, D.C., and this is Manassas. You can see it's only about 30 miles from Washington, D.C. One thing a lot of people don't realize was just how really small the Civil War was. And when I say that, I say that when we think about the Civil War, we think of some of these big battles like Antietam and Gettysburg and Chancellorsville and some of these big battles of the Civil War. They were all fought within about 150 miles of Washington, D.C. Now, obviously, there were wars, battles out in the West, like Vicksburg and Shiloh, and some of those that we'll be talking about too. But when we think about the Civil War, it seemed like we really concentrate on this area right here. And the first one was Manassas Junction, Battle of Bull Run. Now, it occurred, at Manassas Junction in Virginia near a little creek called Bull Run. Now, what that tells you is this: you may get confused a lot because you hear battles called by two different names. Traditionally, the Southerners chose to call the battles by the nearest body of water. So the Battle of Bull Run is what the Southerners called it because it was near Bull Run Creek. The Northerners tended to call it by the local landmarks, such as a village, a town, a church, whatever. So it became known as the Battle of Manassas. So, you're going to you're going to get confused if you let yourself get confused, because Shiloh is also Pittsburgh Landing. Uh, you know, uh, Gettysburg is Gettysburg, you know, Antietam is Sharpsburg. It just, it gets confusing if you let it get confusing. Uh, don't worry too much about it, okay? So by early July, the Union had become aware that there was a large massing of Confederate troops southwest of Washington, D.C., about 30 miles away. Remember, Washington, D.C. is just right across the Potomac River is Virginia, and Maryland, a slave state, although they stayed within the Union, was on the other side. So they were kind of surrounded in a way by Southern sympathizers. Um, Lincoln and his advisors weren't really for sure exactly what the Southerners were doing. Were they defending the position to keep the Union from attacking Richmond, their capital, which is only like 100 miles away? Or were they preparing for a strike into Washington, D.C.? They really didn't know for sure. So uh, Lincoln decides that he's going to order a battle. Now, you might say, why did Lincoln decide it instead of Scott? Well, remember, Scott is 74 years old. He's old. He's infirm. He actually lived kind of in his office. He was so disabled in a sense that there was no way he could lead the troops on the field. He still had his mind about him, but he definitely was not capable of leading the troops in the field. So Lincoln kind of was the one issuing orders. Remember, Lincoln, I won't say he doesn't know what he's doing, but he had almost no experience with the military. This is all new to him. He's only been president. This is July. He's only been president since the 1st of March. He really is learning on the job. And that's not a good thing to be when you're leading the country into a civil war. So he chose to lead the field battle under a command by the name of Irwin McDowell. McDowell was to be reinforced by another general by the name of Robert Patterson. And McDowell was going to lead the army to Manassas or Bull Run Creek, and Patterson was going to go over to the Shenandoah Valley, because over in the Shenandoah Valley, there was another Confederate army under the leadership of Joe Johnston that, was occupying the Shenandoah Valley. That was only like 60 miles away from Manassas. And so Patterson was to go over there and kind of keep him occupied to make sure that he didn't reinforce the commander of the Southern forces at Manassas, which was PGT Beauregard. Remember, Beauregard was the hero of Fort Sumter. He's the big hero of the South in the beginning. So that's what happened. Let's look at Irvin McDowell. We're going to do this a lot. I've told you before, I'm not a military historian. I've got the general idea of the battles, but we're not going to get into all the different maneuvers and all, because frankly, I don't think you would be interested in that. And frankly, I'm not interested in that. If you are, there's plenty of books to read about it. But I'm more interested in the people, because they're really, some of them are characters. Let's put it that way. Irwin McDowell was an 1838 graduate of West Point. By the way, he was a classmate of PGT Beauregard, who was the guy that he was going to be fighting against at Bull Run. And they actually had been pretty good friends throughout their Army career. Remember, it graduated in 1838. It's 1861. So McDowell and Beauregard both were longtime veterans of the U.S. Army. He did serve in the Mexican War, as a lot of these generals did that we will see. But frankly, he really wasn't a combat general. He was kind of a logistic and supply staff officer. So he really had very little command experience. And so when he was given command in Northeast Virginia, he was given because of his relationship to General Scott to some degree, because General Scott and him were very good friends, and Scott had known him for a long time. And also because the Treasury Secretary, Salmon Chase, who was very influential with Lincoln at this period of time in his presidency, kind of put a bug in Lincoln's ear and said, you really need to go with McDowell. He's a good man. He's a good general. He's been around for a long time, and he'll do a good job. And Lincoln really, he wasn't really familiar with these people. And so he went with what Scott and Chase told him to do. Now, personally, McDowell was a huge man. This picture doesn't do him justice. This must have been taken on one of his diets because I understand he was a very big man. Uh, he was a teetotaler, but they said he made up for it in his food. He was kind of a gourmet. He liked his 7-course meals. And even during the war, he always maintained that he would eat 7 courses during his evening meal. He was a big man and a big eater. Uh, he didn't lack intelligence. He was a very smart man. He was a very energetic man. He just didn't have a lot of experience in combat. Uh, on top of that, a lot of his own officers and troops questioned exactly where his sympathies lie. And again, you're going to see this a lot. This is nothing unusual in the Civil War. A lot of soldiers remember, you know, these guys had been friends. They had fought together in the Mexican War. They had been, they had encamped together. They had worked in different forts together. So all of a sudden, you've got them facing each other, and it's kind of hard to just all of a sudden shut off a friendship and try to kill him. And that's what basically McDowell was being ordered to do. He was being ordered to go after Beauregard and Joe Johnson if he got down there and kill them, and kill their men. So he really didn't have a lot of empathy to do that. He didn't really want to do that particularly. And I think that showed through because a lot of his troops kind of wondered, and a lot of his subordinate officers kind of wondered just exactly how loyal he was to the Union. Nobody doubted I probably shouldn't have used that term. He didn't lack loyalty. It's just that was he going to be aggressive enough to fight the battle? So, by the way, if you're really interested in learning more about some of these other officers besides Grant and Lee, we all know a little bit about them. There's some good books. A man by the name of Stephen Woodworth has wrote a couple of books called Grant's Lieutenants. He's he split them up into 2 volumes. The first one is from Cairo to Vicksburg, and the other one is from Chattanooga to Appomattox. If you're interested, you can do that. You can get these books and read about them, and you can learn a lot more about these, Union officers. So let's look at one of the opposing generals. Remember, we've already looked at Beauregard. He was kind of this swashbuckler, kind of type guy. He was very handsome, and he kind of just almost like he looked like he needed to be on a pirate ship. Well, that wasn't the case with Joe Johnson. Joe Johnson was totally different than that. He'd been born into a prominent Virginia family. He was kind of royalty like Lee was. And he had graduated with Robert E. Lee. They were classmates in 1829. So he had been around for a long time, folks. He had 32 years in the military when the war broke out. He had served with distinction in the Mexican War, but General Scott maybe said it best. He said he was a great soldier, but had the unfortunate knack of getting himself shot in every engagement. Seemed like he was wounded a lot, and it seemed like but that kind of was because he was a brave man. During the 1850s, he got into a lot of feuds with then Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, who would later on, of course, become the president of the Confederacy. And so he and Davis didn't particularly care for each other. In fact, they didn't care for each other at all. And it stemmed over a promotion thing. Apparently, Johnston was very particular about promotions. But he thought if somebody got promoted above him that wasn't as deserving or was of lesser rank, he would really get upset about it. And this happened in the 1850s, and it would happen again, as we will see. And this feud kind of festered throughout the Civil War. Joe Johnson was one of those generals that he completes the whole Civil War on the southern side. A lot of generals didn't make it through the war. He did. In fact, case he is the last major officer to surrender to Sherman in North Carolina in 1865. But Joe Johnson was, he didn't get along very well with Jefferson Davis. Now, he was a small man, but he's kind of like a banty rooster. He'd strut around, and he really didn't get along very well with those above him. he was actually kind of a good officer to work with if you were under him. He had a terrific strategic sense. He had a very good concept of strategy. The problem was he didn't always follow through with it. He lacked a lot of administrative uh, abilities to kind of make sure that everything, all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed. He just wasn't very good at that. He was good at thinking about the big plan, but he just wasn't very good at following through with it. One fellow officer called him a military contradiction and a temperamental enigma. So that was Joe Johnson. He is the general that's stationed over in the Shenandoah Valley, about 60 miles away. And Beauregard is stationed, at Manassas. They're going to come together and fight McDowell. Now, if you're interested in a good book about Lee's subordinates, this is a great book. Actually, this was a 3-volume book. I don't think anybody reads the 3 volumes anymore because now it's been pretty much reduced and bridged into a 1-volume book by Douglas Southall Freeman. Douglas Southall Freeman was one of the premier historians of Robert E. Lee for years. Kind of gone out a little bit of vogue because Freeman kind of played into this hero worship of Lee. And as people get a little bit further away from the Civil War, they begin to see that Lee had his warts just like everyone else did. But it's a good book. This is a great book. I've read it. It's a wonderful book. So, how did McDowell plan on beating Beauregard and combined with Johnson? Well, first of all, he didn't really want to fight. Okay, that's the first thing you need to know. He told Lincoln when Lincoln ordered him to go to Manassas and basically engage the enemy. McDowell told Lincoln, he said, my troops aren't ready, President. We've just got all these raw recruits in. Lincoln was kind of he's the commander in chief, and he said, hey, I want a fight. You're green, it is true, but they are green also. You are green alike. That's what he told McDowell. This was recorded, as what he told. So McDowell reluctantly saluted, followed orders, and began marching his 35,000 raw recruits to 30 miles to Manassas Junction, where Beauregard had kind of dug in along Bull Run Creek with 21,000 troops. Now, that was a good omen for the North because McDowell obviously had a lot more troops at his disposal than did Beauregard. The problem was Joe Johnson sitting over there in the Shenandoah Valley, only 60 miles away. So McDowell's plan was to move westward into 3 columns. He was going to move down the Warrenton Turnpike in 3 columns. And then he was going to make a flanking attack on Beauregard's left. And he was going to have 2 of his columns go left and try to come around behind Beauregard, while the one on Beauregard's right would kind of create a diversionary demonstration to try to get Beauregard's attention. Everything seemed to work really good. Patterson had been sent with 18,000 troops to keep Joe Johnston and his 11,000 troops occupied. It all was just really on paper, it was going down great for the Union. The problem was this: Johnston was a lot more of a savvy leader than Patterson. And Patterson kind of dawdled around out there in the Shenandoah Valley once he got there, and he lost Johnston's army. Now, you might say, how in the world do you lose an army? Well, folks, the Shenandoah Valley is a very narrow valley. If you've been there, and I bet some of you have, you know that on both sides are big, tall mountain range, the Appalachian mountain ranges on both sides, and this valley between them. It's really easy to get lost, particularly back in this day. So Johnston got lost. And what he did, he snuck his troops over to a railroad depot, put them on a train, this 11,000 soldiers, and trained them over to Manassas, because Manassas is the junction, Manassas Junction Railroad. Patterson found out about it, but didn't, I understand, did not notify Winfield Scott. The result was that Johnson goes over there and he actually gets to the scene of Manassas without really McDowell or Winfield Scott knowing what's happening. So early morning hours of July 21st, McDowell's two columns cross over Bull Creek, Bull Run Creek at Sudley's Ford, and all of a sudden you've got a battle going at what was called Matthews Hill about 10 o'clock in the morning. So here's a real simple little map. Excuse the maps, please. I drew this map because I did not like any of the maps that I found because, frankly, they were all too complex, and I tried to want to make it as simple as I could. Here's Washington, D.C. Here is Manassas Junction down here, and this is a railroad. And you can see this one, the Manassas Gap Railroad, actually went to the Shenandoah Valley. That's the one that Johnston trained his troops into. And he gets up and he sends his army up here. So you got Beauregard here. You got Stonewall Jackson, who at this time really isn't, no one really knows him yet. He's just kind of in fact, he's a very eccentric character, as you'll see in a minute. And you got Jeb Stuart, a cavalry officer. McDowell has forded Bull Run Creek alongside a man by the name of Ambrose Burnside, and they end up engaging the Southern forces right here on the Warrenton Turnpike. Ends up going over to what's called Henry Hill House, and the battle is on, and it rages. This is a photograph taken. This is a photograph taken the day of the battle by Alexander Gardner, showing some of the Union troops crossing over Sudley's Ford on Bull Run Creek. This is the first time this kind of stuff has ever been seen. This is one of the very first real photographs that you would see of the Civil War, but as the action is preparing to take place. So, what happened in the battle? Well, initially everything went exactly as McDowell planned. He collapsed the Confederate line on the Warrenton Turnpike. They had to retreat back across to Henry Hill House, and Thomas Jackson, who had followed Johnston from the Shenandoah Valley. He was attached to Johnston's army, his brigade was. He came in support because the Confederate army was just really disorganized. One thing you need to know is they very seldom sent all their army in at once. They would always keep some in reserve, is what they called. So when these battles were fought in stages, and Jackson was held in reserve at the beginning, and then he was sent in to reinforce the Confederate army when it kind of got all messed up. And all of a sudden, Jackson and his army comes in, and they're just fighting like crazy. This is what Jackson becomes known for. His army is tough. They're aggressive. They go in for the kill. And sure enough, this is exactly what happens. They begin facing withering fire from the Confederate cannon. And Jackson, even though he was outnumbered, he commanded his army to stand there and take it. And one of the other Confederate generals, when he was asked if Jackson was holding, he said, "There's Jackson standing like a stone wall." And all of a sudden, Stonewall Jackson is born. That becomes his name, and everybody knows him from this point on as Stonewall Jackson. It's also significant in that this is the first time the rebel yell is born. You can hear this if you go on the internet and you do a search for the rebel yell. There's some really neat video of a bunch of the old Confederate soldiers at a reunion back in I think it was the 1920s. And they asked them to do the rebel yell. And these old Confederate soldiers, 50, 60 years later, start doing the rebel yell. And it was just kind of an emotional type thing. And it kind of scared the Union people. It scared them so bad that all of a sudden they panicked. They weren't, they had never been in combat. Most of these troops were young recruits who had not been very well trained. They were just kids for the most part, late teens, early 20s. All of a sudden, they see people dying right in front of them, and they panic, and it becomes a rout. The Yankees are dropping their guns. They're running away from the battle. And the battle becomes known in the South as the Great Skedaddle. Uh, that's an old term, that some of us older people will understand better than some of the younger ones. In the North, it's called the Picnic Battle. And you'll see why here in a couple of minutes. I'll explain why it's called the Picnic Battle. Well, Jefferson Davis had arrived on the scene because he had heard the big battle was taking place. And remember, Richmond's only like 50 miles away. And so he gets on a train and he immediately comes to the scene of the battle. The battle's over. And he encourages his generals, Beauregard, Johnston. He says, "Okay, go after them, guys. Let's go in for the kill here because you've got them on the run now. They're going back to Washington." And they basically said, "No, we can't do it. President Davis, our troops are exhausted. They've fought all day. It's hot. Remember, this is the end of July. It's humid. It's hot." And he said, "We can't do it." Um, Davis is not very happy about that. Now, there's immediate fallout. McDowell, was blamed for the loss, and it's kind of unfair in a way because McDowell wasn't a bad general. He just wasn't a combat general, and he was put in a position that he probably shouldn't have been in. And he tried to tell them, "Guys, we're not ready," but they insisted he do battle, so he did. So he is basically blamed for the loss. He doesn't lose. He's not fired from the Army. In fact, he continues fighting throughout the Civil War in a subordinate position. Uh, we will see that Lincoln replaces him with a young general by the name of George McClellan. We're going to hear a lot more about George McClellan. George McClellan is one of these real important people in the early part of the Civil War. Patterson, who's over in the Shenandoah Valley, who lost Johnston's army and allowed him to get to Manassas Junction or Bull Run being undetected, is fired. He's 69 years old, and frankly, he probably didn't have any business out there in the field, commanding an army to begin with. They fire him and send him home. They say, "You're gone, go." More importantly, Lincoln realized the hope of a quick war was over. Everybody thought, "Hey, we're going to win this thing just like that." Didn't happen, folks. The next day, Lincoln, realizing that it's going to be a long and difficult war, signs a proclamation and order providing for the enlistment of 500,000 men for 3 years. The losses were pretty significant. 460 Union soldiers killed, over 1,100 wounded, and over 1,100 missing in action. Confederate losses were less. They were 387 killed and over about 1,600 wounded, not very many missing in action. So it's a pretty serious battle, folks. This is a big battle as such. And to some degree, the victory belonged to this really unknown general by the name of Stonewall Jackson. Now, Stonewall Jackson was a character. Let me tell you, if you want to read about an interesting general in the Civil War and a good general in the Civil War, you ought to be reading a book about Stonewall Jackson. I'll recommend one here in a minute. Stonewall Jackson was a Virginian, as a lot of these generals were. He was orphaned at a very young age and had to go and be raised by a bunch of bachelor uncles. So he never really was around women very much as a young person. Had very little formal education. Never was able to go to school very much because he was busy working as a child for these bachelor uncles. Somehow, he got admitted to West Point, and I've just finished reading biography of Stonewall Jackson, and it was kind of by accident, really. A person that was sent to West Point, nominated and sent to West Point from his congressional district, and that's how it's done, lasted one day and came back. And there really wasn't anybody else that had applied except for Jackson. So the congressman decided that he was going to send him, even though nobody thought he was going to make it, because really he was absolutely academically unprepared for West Point. West Point at this point was an engineering school, and Jackson was lacking in any kind of formal education. Somehow, through will, he ended up finishing 17th in his class. In fact, the case he started almost dead last after the first year And by the time he got done, uh, he was up towards the upper third of his class. So it was it was a pretty good accomplishment on his part. He was a very intelligent man. He just wasn't very well schooled before West Point. Uh, like a lot of West Pointers, he got out of West Point just as the Mexican War was beginning. He went to serve in the Mexican War. He did okay. He didn't do anything spectacular. And when the war ended, he got a job teaching at the Virginia Military Institute because they wanted a veteran to go there. And VMI wasn't very much of a big school at this point. And so they said, "Hey, we need a hero from the Mexican War." So they hired Stonewall Jackson to teach uh, what was basically physics and artillery. Now, by all accounts, he was an absolutely horrible teacher. I mean, maybe one of the worst teachers that's ever taught at VMI or anywhere else. His nickname by the students and his fellow teachers was Tom Fool. He was not a good teacher. That was not his vocation. He had no business being, a teacher. But he lasted. He stayed for almost 10 years. So you got to give him credit. He was tenacious, and you got to give credit to the people at VMI because they put up with him. On top of that, Jackson was. There's only one way to say it, folks. He was weird. He's just a weird guy. He was extremely eccentric. And on top of that, he was a hypochondriac to the extreme. Look at some of the things here. He suffered sinus, arthritis, and stomach problems, which he did suffer from it. But this is what he would do. They said he would stand for long periods with, to keep his internal organs in place. He thought that if he sat down or lay down, his organs would get out of place and he would not be able to function as well. So he stood for long periods of time. They said he was also holding one arm straight up in the air since he thought it was longer than the other one. I don't know. He said he hated pepper, and a lot of people hate pepper, but the reason he hated it because he said it made his left leg ache. Go figure, okay? And his diet was just extremely weird. He ate almost nothing but stale bread, milk, and lemons. He loved lemons, and if he could get his hands on them, he'd eat them whole and raw. And he liked stale bread. He wanted it hard, and he wanted. I understand he wanted buttermilk more than milk. So that was what he ate. He almost never ate meat. He absolutely did not drink. In fact, the case he was an extremely religious person. He was a devout Christian. One person said he prayed like Jesus, but fought like Joshua. And that's true, folks. They said that he was always praying. He would pray in the saddle as the battle was going on. Anytime something happened, he prayed. He was a prayer warrior, and he was a warrior. I mean, he was extremely aggressive in battle. He was this kind, gentle man until the guns started firing, and then he turned into a demon. Okay. This is just an absolutely fantastic book. I had read another book about Stonewall Jackson some years back, and it was a good book, but I decided I want to refresh my memory. And so I just finished reading this book the other day, and it is just a great book. If you want to really read about Stonewall Jackson, this is the by far and away, I think, probably the best biography written about him. Rebel Yell. So by written by the name of a man by the S.C. Gwynn. Okay, now I mentioned that the battle was called the Great Skedaddle in the South because they were, everybody ran away from the North. In the North, they called it the Picnic Battle, and you may have heard about this. What happened was this: when the first Battle of Bull Run, everybody knew it was getting ready to take place in Washington, and so a lot of the people in Washington decided they wanted to go watch this battle because they were so sure that it was going to end in a complete rout of the Confederacy, that there was no way the Confederacy was going to hold up against this grand and glorious U.S. Army. So they packed picnic lunches, women, children, members of Congress, packed picnic lunches, got in buggies on horseback, and rode to within about 4 or 5 miles of the battle and sit down on, quilts and begin eating their lunch, watching the battle because it was kind of on a flat plain. And what they saw was a disaster in the making for the North. One Union officer said they saw a throng of sightseers in carriages, buggies, and horseback sitting on the ground. So, as the picnic turned out to be a Union rout, all these sightseers got caught up in the battle in the rout, and all of a sudden you got these Union soldiers literally running away from the battle back towards Washington D.C., trying to get rides in the buggies, trying to get on horses, running. It's just an absolute disaster. And they said that some of the congressmen tried to stop it and tried to get them to go back and fight, and they just ignored them. And it was a really a bad scene for the Union Army. One of the Confederate soldiers wrote home about this, and I found this. I thought it was really interesting. He wrote to his cousin and said, most Union soldiers must have gone into Washington naked, for we have everything they could have: clothes, arms, knapsacks, provisions, tents, medicines, daguerreotypes, and love letters. So it was just an absolute disaster for the North, this first battle. Now, as it turns out, when you look later on, in comparison to future battles, it really wasn't that big because some of these battles were just horrific in the amount of people that are killed in them. But it was such a shock to the North. They could not believe this had happened, folks. And all of a sudden, you've got this victorious Southern Army sitting on the doorstep of the nation's capital. And it was only because Beauregard and Johnston said we can't follow through that they end up, getting away without being completely destroyed, and maybe the capital being seized. Davis wasn't happy with either one of their leaders. He was very unhappy with Johnston and Beauregard because they wouldn't follow through and pursue the Union Army. On top of that, as we will see, they both weren't happy with Davis. And so, this long simmering feud between Davis and Johnston erupts. So I thought this would be a good time to look at a little short film. I've got these 4 Civil War in 4 minutes, and I thought this one was a really good one.
What did the Civil War soldier wear? In a word, everything. Whether he was Union or Confederate, the Civil War soldier was responsible for carrying all of his personal goods from camp on the march to the battlefield and all over again from the time he enlisted in 1861 till the time he went home in 1865. So starting with one of the most basic necessities, the soldier is going to wear his food, namely in a haversack. Typically, this included 3 days' worth of bread, meat, and coffee, along with any cooking utensils that they would have. Their cooking utensils, by the way, they provide themselves. Water was carried in a canteen like this one. This is covered in jean cloth. Most canteens are covered in some sort of covering to help keep the water inside cool. Necessary for any soldier is their ammunition. The ammunition would be carried in the cartridge box right here. The cartridge box would probably weigh between 4 or 5 pounds because it is full of 40 rounds of lead and the powder that goes with it. So it seems easy to carry it on my body right now, but imagine this loaded down with 4 or 5 pounds, and you've got an idea of what it might be like to carry this on the march. You'll also notice that I am wearing a knapsack. This is the regulation knapsack that would have been issued to soldiers in the Union Army. Confederates have them too, either by issue or more often from taking them from captured or dead Yankees. In here I have a blanket, a change of clothing, my shelter half, or half of a tent, which I would share with a buddy, and any other ground cloth that I might want to use to keep me protected from the elements. In other words, the knapsack is the soldier's house. There were many varieties of hats that were seen during the Civil War. The one I'm wearing now, the 1858 fatigue cap or forage cap, was by far the most common. Confederates often wore civilian hats, mostly due to a lack of enforcement of regulations in the Confederate armies. The next most obvious piece of clothing is the jacket or the coat worn by the soldier. Union troops wore blue most of the time. Confederates wore gray or some version of tan or butternut, sort of off gray color. There were also many varieties of coats used in both armies, but the average Civil War soldier would have been wearing what I am wearing now, which is a 4-button coat known as a sack coat or fatigue blouse. There's more variety in coats in the Confederate Army, where each state is providing different clothing for its own troops. And the trousers, along with the coat and even the cap, are all made of wool. For us today, it seems a little bit strange to be standing on a battlefield, say in July of 1863, and wearing wool outside in the sun. But we have to remember that wool actually wicks moisture away from the body, so it actually stays quite cool. And more importantly, wool is durable. Imagine marching through the woods at Spotsylvania Courthouse and getting caught on nettles and briars wearing an Under Armour shirt or a pair of cotton pants. You'd be torn up. But in a pair of wool trousers and in a wool jacket, that wool is going to withstand much more the rigors of the active life of a soldier. Soldiers in both armies would have been issued shoes or boots like the one I'm wearing. These are made of leather, and they are also designed to be durable. Though remember, these are pegged soles, so sometimes they come apart, and that's why soldiers in both armies often go barefoot. Soldiers were also required to provide their own socks, so soldiers are frequently writing home asking for a new pair of socks from their loved ones. Soldiers in both armies would have been issued Canton flannel shirts, which they thought were itchy and uncomfortable. They often called them hair shirts, and many soldiers preferred to wear cotton shirtings like the one I'm wearing now. Last but not least, I have my musket, or my rifle musket. This is an 1861 Springfield, which was the standard issue long arm of the United States Army during the Civil War. Confederates also had access to some weapons like this, or its British counterpart, the 1853 Enfield, and there was also a number of different European varieties of the rifle musket that were used by both armies during the American Civil War. On my waist belt, I have a cap pouch, which carries the percussion caps, which are vital to the firing process of a rifle musket, as well as my bayonet. The bayonet attaches to the muzzle of the rifle musket, turning this firearm into a pike. Well, I suggest to you that if you want to understand the soldier experience of the American Civil War, put on one of their uniforms. Wear the hat, wear the wool, carry the knapsack, and carry the rifle musket, and see what the weight of war feels like on your shoulders.
Okay, well, that's it for today. Next week, we're going to look at what happens after the Battle of Bull Run. Big changes taking place, particularly in the Union Army. You're going to see the rise of a man by the name of, George McClellan, who was just an important figure in the first year of the Civil War. Got into a lot of scrapes with President Lincoln, but he was a good general, except for one thing: he didn't want to fight. Yeah, we'll talk about that next week. So I will let you go, and we will see you next week, hopefully. And so long.